So we're going to get started. I appreciate your patience here. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. I spent quite a few years in Boston working on issues related to digital equity and digital inclusion. And so it's always a pleasure to hear from folks who are doing this work on the ground who really have a passion for this work. It is a struggle, as we heard from the gentleman who has the third least connectivity within his community. We know what that's like for our folks, and we want to make sure we're finding solutions to that. And so one of the things that we believe at Next Century Cities is how important it is for local officials in cities to actually get engaged in this work. And so today we're going to hear about some engagement that's happening at that level and also some interesting things that are happening at the federal level. And we're going to start first by having each of our panelists introduce themselves and tell a little bit about the work that they're doing. And I'm going to start right here on my left with Francella.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Francella Ochillo. I am the Director of Legal and Government Affairs with the National Hispanic Media Coalition. We are a nonprofit that's based in California. However, I work in the policy office that's based in Washington, D.C. And our main focus is not only to give Latinos a voice in Washington, but also to make sure that we represent low-income and marginalized communities across the country and focus on keeping them connected. And so when I try to explain to people what essentially is in my portfolio, we think of all of the policy work that we do on a federal level as thinking about a digital ecosystem. And basically, there are people who are connected and there are people who are not connected. And we have to think about what does it cost to keep the people who are disconnected, to keep them there, and what is it going to cost for us to find a way to onboard them into this digital economy. And so when we focus on our issues, usually through the FCC, we focus on what is an obstacle to getting them connected. So that might actually be the accessibility in their neighborhood. It might be affordability in their household budget. So we work on tackling those issues. And secondly, we work on translating these issues for public consumption so that it's not only the small group of people who always participate in these policy conversations aren't always controlling the narrative. So we focus on basically lifting up those voices and finding a way to make sure that everyone really understands how that federal policy trickles down into your communities.
She'll be a great person to talk to about Lifeline. So, Liz.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Liz Lazar. I'm the Director of Programs and Partnerships at a nonprofit called DigitalC, located in Cleveland, Ohio. DigitalC is focused on leveraging technology for community impact. We do that in a number of ways. At the heart of the organization, though, is a program called Connect the Unconnected. So Cleveland used to be the third least connected city. I guess that's Allentown now. You stole our designation. We're now the sixth least connected city in the country, still not sitting in a wonderful place when it comes to internet access for our residents. Connect the Unconnected hopes to address this by leveraging some of the fiber assets that DigitalC owns, as well as nascent technologies like millimeter wave, through a partnership with our public housing authority. So the largest proportion of disconnected folks in Cleveland are public housing residents. So our first mission-based programming for Connect the Unconnected was bringing access to 6 different public housing high-rise buildings within the city of Cleveland. We're now expanding beyond that and using some mesh wireless technologies to actually explore bringing connectivity to single-family homes in addition to the public housing residents. So I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit further in our discussions, but that's the heart of our mission and the work that I am tasked with doing.
Majestic.
Good morning. My name is Majestic Lane, Deputy Chief of Staff to Mayor William Peduto. And it's an honor to be here. I know the mayor was here earlier and spoke and kind of opened everything up, but it's definitely an honor for you to be here in our great city. And so I'm a Deputy Chief of Staff, but specifically, previously, some of my work was around, I was a Deputy Chief of Neighborhood Empowerment. And within that, a lot of my work looked at equity, opportunity, and quality of life. And as part of that kind of, roadmap, the inclusive innovation and talking about digital literacy and digital equity became something that I became interested in, because as we know, we'll talk about, you hear so much about Pittsburgh and its role and its relationship to technology, and just literally maybe 5 blocks up the street, you have communities that are totally disconnected from the digital economy, totally disconnected from much of the boom that we're talking about. So the administration has made it our task to really build that roadmap for inclusive innovation with many of the folks who are in the audience today, and really make sure that we connect in deeper ways. And I think today we'll talk about some of the ways that we're trying to do that.
Angelique?
I'm Dr. Angelique Johnson. I wear several hats, but I'm primarily here with my digital inclusion hat. So I am the Digital Inclusion Fellow at 1804 Entrepreneurial Center. It's a nonprofit that is a spin-out actually from an Indiana incubator that's now moved into Louisville. And it's sponsored, my fellowship is actually sponsored by Google Fiber. And Grace Simrel actually was going to be here. She's the Chief Innovation Officer at Louisville Metro Government, and they're doing some wonderful things there. Some caveats. I need to work for Google Fiber or Metro Louisville, so I can answer some light questions on both. But I primarily work with my startup, two startups. One is a medical device startup where we're actually trying to increase access to medical technologies. And the other one is called Vissionaireum, which kind of ties a little bit more into what we just talked about, which is how do we get more underrepresented entrepreneurs trained, and specifically, sliding back to digital, trained in a digital skill set. So if you want to be an entrepreneur, start a company, get into the small business area, you really can't do that without a basic set of digital skill sets. And then even from there, you need to go on to a more advanced set. So we do web development training. We teach online business model canvas using NSF's training on the lean launch startup model. We do QuickBooks training and things like that. So it's really making sure that people are not only learning a digital skill set, just to increase the, the loveliness of being at home, but really it all ties back to economic wealth and how they can create wealth for their families to really make an impact and really understand why digital inclusion is good for them.
Thank you. Bill?
My name is Bill Callahan. I'm the, what do we call it? Well, essentially the policy director of National Digital Inclusion Alliance, which is a national organization that was created about 3 years ago, specifically for the purpose of creating a voice for people who are what we call digital inclusion practitioners in communities around the country. That includes a whole variety of different kinds of organizations. At this point, we have about 340 affiliated organizations in just shy of 40 states and territories. And those include, I think, 40 city governments, includes 30 major library systems, but it also includes about 120 community nonprofits. And what that reflects is the diversity of people and organizations who've actually taken responsibility in their own community to do the digital inclusion that may lead to digital equity. One of the things we try to do is to clarify the terminology a little bit. And so we have on our website definitions of those things. And after a lot of talk on our listserv, we decided that digital inclusion is the process and digital equity is the product. But the point is that the focus of both is primarily people of whom there are very, very many, particularly in older cities, as well as in rural areas, who don't have the skills or increasingly simply the resources to be able to have mainstream, productive, creative relationships to the technology that everybody needs to do whatever it is they're trying to do. And the other thing I would say is I do have another hat. All of that policy director sounds very grand, but it's 10 hours a week. What I do with the rest of my time is work in Cleveland with an organization called Connect Your Community, which is a kind of advocacy organization around these issues that tells people about what Liz is doing and what Liz's partners are doing, and does things like research on AT&T redlining in the city and that kind of stuff. So those are my two hats.
Thank you. So we're going to start with a question you've already begun to answer. Who is unconnected in our cities? Why are they unconnected? What things must we be doing, thinking about, planning for, in order to change that data? So I'm going to ask you to just have a conversation, jump in.
So the first thing I'd like to say, because this refers to something that Blair was talking about earlier, we do have tend to make a heavy distinction between the countryside and the city when it comes to these issues. So I want to say that I got up this morning in a property that my wife and I own in Ashtabula County in the northeast corner of Ohio, on an Amish road where Windstream had to run a line down across the trees to get it into our house, and we get 5 megs for $75 a month. And when I go home tomorrow, I will go home to a home in the near inner city, the near west side of Cleveland, which has been served by cable and telephone forever, right? And I will have in my house a Spectrum line, because you better, right? Because the alternative is 5 megs for $65 a month from AT&T, right? The idea that we have access problems in the countryside, but adoption programs in the city, is a vast overgeneralization of the situation that we have. In truth, in Ohio, there are virtually equal numbers of people who can't get decent broadband in rural counties because it isn't there, or who don't have broadband because they can't afford it in the major cities, right? And so that's a distinction that we really need to break down. But the people who don't have it because either it's because of their disadvantage, right? Not because they would buy it happily if it was there on the street. It just isn't there. In Cleveland and many other places we talk about share certain characteristics that are a lot like all the other profiles of people who various other interest groups want to serve in our cities. They're low income. They work in crappy, underpaid jobs, and in large part that's because the education system of the city failed them badly for 40 years. And so the consequence is that you have a combination of not having the skills, not having affordable connectivity, something that costs you less than $65 a month, which might as well be on Mars for most people, and or not being able to afford a computer or a smartphone that actually works and stays on all month, or whatever your device is. And so our view of the problem is that it's certainly true that this leads to all kinds of other problems that you can address, but there's a core problem, which is simply that for that combination of reasons, which often just comes down to cost and poverty, people simply don't have the experience of having a real connection to the internet that allows them to learn how to use it.
I'll just say, I think, very similar. I think the people who we know are not connected are people who you find are disconnected from the mainstream of American economy writ large right now. So whether it's rural communities that have gone through loss of industry, or if it's, quote unquote inner city and increasingly first ring suburb communities in cities that have gone through the same thing. I think I don't think you'll find folks who are totally connected but yet haven't been educated, or totally connected and don't go through infant mortality. So I think that, having the conversation around digital equity should be connected to some of the broader things that we're talking about, so that we don't put it in silos. Because to your point about the interest groups, folks go, okay, that's a health problem. But maybe the health problem is connected to digital equity. Maybe if folks had internet that moved faster, they could look up something about if a child was sick. We could avoid a whole bunch of other things, right? And so I think that it should be seen, and increasingly it is being seen, as a part of a broader quality of life spectrum. And that was what was important to me, is that seeing digital equity not as something extra that people should have. A lot of people will say, well, why do you need the internet? Well, why do you need the internet, right? Like, it is as essential to your life as anything else. Everyone in here is taking advantage of a whole bunch of broadband and a whole bunch of access, right? And so especially those who have been disconnected need that level of access as a central point of quality of life and not as an extra. So me understanding that and our administration understanding that has helped us see it not as something just to be added on, but an essential part of the work.
do want to add something to this, because as we're talking about how some of these communities, there are lots of ways that we can look at the problem. We can look at it as a multidimensional issue where it's connected to other socioeconomic problems. You can think about, well, how can I as a provider go in and attack this problem in our actual community, because maybe I'm really good at infrastructure and I'm going to focus on that solution. And then sometimes I think it's going to take us bringing other stakeholders to the table to actually rethink how we think about who deserves access. And I think if we change who deserves access, it's gonna force us to come up with better solutions. And so when I think about some of the work that we do, Deb mentioned that NHMC works a lot on Lifeline, and we dig into the statistics of what communities are disconnected. So if you're looking at it from when you're looking at the ethnic makeup, you might say if 80% of white America is connected to broadband, there are minority counterparts that are similarly situated. For Hispanics, it might only be 60 to 70% of them. African American communities slightly higher, but if you look at Native American communities, it's dismally low. And so the thing is, you can look at it lots of different ways about economics. If you look at it in terms of households that make under $25,000 per household are the most disconnected in the nation. So there are lots of ways that we can look at this problem, but at the core of all of those solutions, if we do not change who deserves access, who deserves to sit at the table, who deserves to be connected, we are not going to come up with better solutions. Because very often, earlier this year when the FCC, the Lifeline program that I mentioned earlier, when the FCC basically made lots of proposals that are going to slash the program. For those of you who don't know, Lifeline is a low-income subsidy, the only telecommunication subsidy in the country. And what it helps is low-income families get connected. Originally, it was to phone, and then the broadband modernization order added broadband to that. And what it focuses on is making sure, number one, you acknowledge that the internet is essential for people to have, regular interactions, whether that's education, jobs, whatever. And it actually goes the step further and says, look, we're going to find a way to actually give them a set of providers that actually does a low-cost competitive product. But the proposals that the FCC has issued earlier this year will drastically cut the amount of service that's available and the people that it's going to be able to help. So what do you do when the federal government is really like failing their promise to low-income people? We're going to have to find a way to do this in your states, in your communities, and find a way to rethink it. Because the truth of the matter is there's a very small population of people in Washington that are having that conversation about an entire nation of over 300 million people. And if we don't find a way to transport their voices into Washington, D.C., or find a way to get local stakeholders to go and stand up for them in Washington, D.C., then we're all stuck, because there is a cost to keeping people disconnected.
I just want to add really quickly, in Cleveland, if you overlay a map of the disconnected neighborhoods, folks who don't have access, over a map of folks who were redlined back in the day in the mortgage industry, it's one and the same. And Bill can go on and on about this and give you a lot more insight. But for us, one of the ways that we have chosen to address this is to engage with community anchor institutions who selfishly can see how their bottom line is affected when certain people are not connected. We built, an initial network kind of as a demonstration of what's possible when you start bringing people online. And utilizing that build it and they will come model. We've had investors, from the community come forward and say, we realize how this will impact our clientele, our ability to serve our clientele, and how we can, help start addressing this issue and also then benefit ourselves. So that was one approach. But I think to your point, it's incredibly important for us to continue to advocate for this, because the longer we leave people behind, the gap is getting so wide. I mean, when we look at the digital literacy training that we lead, people are incapable of even understanding how to operate a computer. So think about that in today's world. Think about any job where you don't need that skill set. It doesn't exist anymore. So it's terribly important that we work on that.
Dr. Johnson, will you talk to us a little bit, because it's really interesting the work you're doing with entrepreneurs. Can you talk a little bit about how this lack of access has impacted the capacity for that entrepreneurial spirit to actually succeed?
It's actually really detrimental to it. If you're a new, aspiring entrepreneur, you're in some of the zones, right, that people have talked about, whether it's a low-income area, whether it's an area that's segregated by race. So there, you have zones in Louisville where it's not necessarily entirely low income, but because the city itself is somewhat segregated, you have the redlining issue. And so you might be over in an area and be middle income, but you might not have access. So if you're in those zones and you're trying to start a business, and a lot of businesses nowadays are e-commerce based, then your only option is, well, maybe I can go find a local library and go to that. But then how many people consider the local library and work on their business? And then on top of that, if you don't have access to internet in your home, if you don't have access to hardware, so in Louisville, we have a three-pronged approach. It's increasing access to internet, it's increasing access to hardware. If you don't have a computer, then you really can't have a business. There's not much about business that you can run on your phone alone. And then the other thing is digital skills training. So if you're an entrepreneur coming up without, these three things, then it becomes very hard to push your business forward to generate revenue. And so what we do is we actually go out into the community. We find entrepreneurs that are in these spaces by just attending the community events that they attend, by showing up in the places and spaces that they are at and saying, hey, is there something that you're looking for on the digital side, right? And observing that, and then giving that to them. And so right now we have 7 companies that are going through an accelerator program, and it's all based on digital skill set training for entrepreneurs. So we're addressing the legal, doing digital legal libraries, showing them how to break down contracts. How do you pull something, from LegalZoom and really slice and dice it? And for a lot of individuals, you'd be surprised how many people, although they don't have access, they are familiar. People are not at a deficit mentally, they're not at a deficit ambition-wise. They're familiar with these things. They just want to get trained in how to use it so that they can generate revenue for their business. And so we do the legal side, we do the accounting side with QuickBooks, and also looking at some Excel spreadsheets. We do strategic planning using the Lean Launch Startup model, and then we do branding and marketing. So as most people in this room know, branding and marketing is a high cost. If you're coming from a lot of these zones, you don't have the funds to do that, but there is a whole suite of online apps and tools that you can use to get your brand up and going until you've generated enough revenue to bring on a marketing person. So we really focus on giving those digital skill sets, but specifically for underrepresented entrepreneurs and things that are going to generate more revenue for their businesses.
That's really interesting. Majestic, we listened to the mayor talk this morning about how the tech economy here is really beginning to boom, and his concern about ensuring that that lifts everyone. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing here in Pittsburgh?
Yeah. So about 4 years ago, when Mayor Peduto first got in office, began the roadmap to inclusive innovation. And it's really just a way of doing business around collaborating, engaging with all kind of partners, because we know, and if you spend enough time in the city, you'll just see the role of tech and innovation in our city. Like I would assume in most cities here, especially most large urban cities, there's a competition for talent and a competition for people and around innovation and tech and being the cities of the future. And as we see our cities becoming a city of the future for so many, again, we have neighborhoods that are entirely disconnected, even though spatially they're really connected to downtown or connected to our universities. So the roadmap is really, where's this space of collaboration, and how can the administration act as a locus for this kind of collaboration and facilitation of engagement? And so this year in April, we had our third one, if I'm correct, and it was the biggest one ever. Successfully went on for an entire week, and just covered everything from blockchain to how do Black women create apps, to how are you engaging folks in English as a second language around technology and digital equity. And what you really found is that this is a big kind of place. It seemed really narrow to say, okay, you're going to have an inclusive innovation week, but we found we covered the gamut. And I want to give a shout out to Christine and the team for the inclusive innovation and INP around doing that, and Ether from our office, because we really saw that this is really something that now needs to happen every month, right? This is not just a part of something that happens once a year. We do it, it's a big event, but now it has to be kind of written into the code, if you will, of how we're doing work. And as long as, just like we're doing work around economic development in its traditional sense, kind of like getting folks to work, construction, and all the things that people think about, we also now have to engage this in a deeper way. Also, one thing I'll say that was interesting about it was a collaboration between our economic development authority, the Urban Redevelopment Authority, and the city. So it also speaks to recognizing that, we want to kind of bring this a little closer where we know we're making investments in tech, we're making investments in incubators, but we also need to make investments in communities. And so this has really become a part of what the mayor sees going forward. And also I'll add that last year, as part of our My Brother's Keeper work, we worked with the Heinz Endowments, and they actually sponsored a digital literacy collaborative. And part of that was taking organizations who were not as digitally engaged when working with young people and connecting them to those that were. Because we find, even in the nonprofit community-based organization realm, that some organizations do great work with young people, but they're not tech savvy. They're not savvy, so they're not passing that on to the young people. And some organizations have a lot of infrastructure, a lot of hardware, a lot of things, and they are. So that was a grant that we did to be able to connect those folks so that those organizations could have access to that digital equity. So there's a number of things that we're working on.
And I want to follow up on that for just one other piece of your innovation week and your inclusive innovation efforts. And that's a group we haven't really talked about, and that's folks who are disabled, right? So you do a lot of work during that week in support of the disabled population here
Yes.
in Pittsburgh. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, yes, and again, that's just, the mayor may have said it today, if it's not for all of us, it's not for any of us. And that's really kind of the ethic of it. And so, there was a whole suite of activities and resources around the disabled community and how to get access, because when we think about it, we often do talk about folks, in the inner city, disconnected folks, but not always other communities that, for a variety of reasons, even if they're not always poor, frankly, just are disconnected, right? So that was a concerted effort we made to make sure that we're providing the proper services and connecting with the organizations who are providing services to the disability community so that they can actually be now included and connect to others. So it was a focus.
It was really impressive work. And Bill, I'm going to go to you now and ask you, you did a lot of work on investigating issues related to redlining in Cleveland, in other cities as well. Can you, one, tell us a little bit about what you learned, and two, if there are folks here who are interested in engaging around figuring that out for their communities, any recommendations you might have?
Sure. So in March of last year, National Digital Inclusion Alliance and our local organization, Connect Your Community, released the first of what have now been about 4 local mapping analyses of FCC Form 477 data. If you don't know what that is, and many of you actually I think have to report it, it's data that regulated internet providers, broadband providers, as well as others, telecommunications providers, have to file every 6 months with the FCC. And it includes a variety of data that the FCC uses to draw its big picture of broadband and telecom developments, but they also release the data in the case of availability and speed at the census block level and at the level for adoption, households that actually have meet certain broadband benchmarks. They release that at the census tract level. So for a variety of reasons that really grew out of our attempt to figure out where people could get the access from AT&T discount program in Cleveland, because we were getting all these calls from people basically saying, hey, they won't turn me on, I don't have fast enough speed, right? We originally started looking at that Form 477 data and mapping it to figure out just where could we go knock on doors and tell people they can get this, right? It was as simple as that. We were trying to do a campaign. And what we quickly discovered is that the pattern was the classic ADSL concentric ring around the central office pattern, which is to say if you're close to the wire center, you're close to the AT&T central office, you get okay speed, and you get half a mile away and it's down to 10 megs, and you get a mile away and it's down to 3 megs, and you get a mile and a quarter away and it's down to 768, and then it goes away, right? So what did that tell us? Well, it told us that AT&T hadn't deployed anything since 2005 in those neighborhoods, right? Because that you wouldn't see that if they had deployed their standard broadband enhancement technology, which was essentially fiber to the node, fiber to the neighborhood, kind of hybrid, fiber out to a box on what we call the tree lawn, and then copper out to houses from there, but where you get much faster speeds, but you also don't get those concentric ring patterns. So that is basically where this came from, right? The question is, so how did that happen, right? Why is it that there are large parts of the city, and where? And so when we finally did an exhaustive mapping, we did some homework about it, and we realized that AT&T, despite, and totally covertly, because we have no regulation of broadband at all in Ohio now, local or state, and they certainly weren't going to fess up to it, so they will deny it till the cows come home, but totally covertly, AT&T had gone and done its whole competitive fiber deployment between 2008 and 2014, but they had forgotten to do any of it in 3 central office areas in the city of Cleveland. And lo and behold, those were the central office areas where the poor people lived. Now, because of the patterns in Cleveland, most of those poor people are African American, right? And so it is absolutely true that those patterns are also very, very close to mortgage redlining patterns from the 70s, right? And all kinds of other service redlining issues, insurance and other things that you can find. But in this case, it was AT&T, had nothing to do with any banks, and it was AT&T making a decision not to invest in those facilities where they thought illegally that they should avoid investing because of the income of the area in which customers live, which is specifically forbidden by both state and federal law, right? So that's what we mean by redlining. It isn't just, oh gosh, the service is too slow in 2 areas where people can't. We use the term redlining because it is virtually an identical phenomenon to bank redlining 40 years ago. It is institutions making a decision not to invest in facilities that would allow or develop products that would allow large constituencies who happen not to fit the ideal income profile. In this case, we think it's income, not race, although you can never tell. And as a consequence, they just, and also never telling anybody, right? And denying them and say. So we've since done that same analysis with the maps for Detroit, which we did fairly quickly, and Toledo and Dayton. And we've also looked at some other cities in cooperation with city governments or other folks. And I can tell you this is a very common phenomenon. This is AT&T we're talking about, right? We're sitting in Verizon territory, right? Verizon, we used to say, well, look, Verizon doesn't do this because in the states where Verizon serves, they still have municipal franchise obligations, like in Pittsburgh, and therefore, when they did FiOS in Pittsburgh in 2008, they had a deployment obligation, and I know there's been some controversies about, some corners of that, but nonetheless, FiOS is in most of Pittsburgh. What we sort of figured out later is that there's some cities that aren't so lucky, Buffalo, Baltimore, right, where so Verizon just decided it wasn't worth it to them to have a citywide deployment obligation, so they just stayed out of the city. So that's what we're talking about with redlining. Those are the 2 systems we've looked at, right? And if anybody lives in those territories and is interested in talking about how it affects your city, at this point we'd be delighted, and we're very interested in NDIA in talking to your community, anybody in your community, about how to do that analysis. I am not going to tell you that you will always find it. You find it in places where there's a particular market situation where the company made a decision, and it happens to be the case in most AT&T states that they could cherry pick neighborhoods within cities, so they did, right? Whereas in Verizon territory, it tends to be a stay out of the city, right, because of municipal franchising, so that's the pattern.
Thanks, Bill. And Liz, given that you have this data now about redlining here in the city, and you probably knew intuitively, but now you have data, how did that influence the work you're doing, and how have you moved forward?
It heavily influenced our work. We did, have an inkling and an idea of where people were disconnected, and we're focusing our work in those areas as well. But We actually recently located into one of these hardest hit neighborhoods. Huff is one of the most underserved communities in Cleveland, and back in March we opened a community co-working space in that neighborhood. It's called the Midtown Tech Hive. Different from other co-working models, not so much that we're not targeting entrepreneurs, we are, but we're more trying to create a space that is directly for the people of the community to come and learn about technology, partake in technology training courses, and then seed their way into some entrepreneurship activities once they start building some digital skills. And the things that we're seeing are there's a fear, an inherent fear of what is unknown. So a lot of folks will approach our classes and say, somebody told me to come here and take this class because it's free, and I don't really know why I'm here. And 3 or 4 weeks later, there's just a drastic difference in enthusiasm and understanding of what doors can be opened by technology, and it's always, what else can I learn now? What's the next class that I can take? So it's been a really wonderful experience for us to be able to start doing this work right in our backyard and to locate in an area that has such need, and then also just to be able to make sure that we are continuing that transformation that needs to occur in the city for us to make an impact on this.
Deb?
Yep, and
Could I just add one fact about which I should have mentioned? So what's it mean that the neighborhood got redlined, right? What does it mean that 60% of Cleveland doesn't have 10-year-old upgrades to AT&T's network? Well, it means two things. One is that a lot of people in those areas can't get from AT&T anything faster than 3 megs. Or 6 megs or whatever, which means there's no competitive presence. So all they can get is cable modem service, which costs $65 a month minimum, right? And there's also no tiering, so there's no cheaper variety of service. But the other really important thing is there's no fiber, right? In the places where they did the deployment, they did fiber to the node. They did fiber to the neighborhood. Those are places where 5G is imaginable, right? Every place else in the city, they talk about how they're eventually going to do a wireless deployment. No, they're not. They don't have any fiber there, right? So this is an economic development impact, a neighborhood-level economic development impact that may, in fact, be more important to your city government than the consumer impact.
And I think the mayor talked about that this morning, that it is exacerbating the problems that exist. So I'm going to go to questions in the audience in just a minute, but I wanted to ask you, Francella, you talked about the things that are happening at the FCC that are detrimental to the communities we wish to be better serving. What recommendations would you have to folks around how to respond to that? How could they join NHMC and other organizations in pushing back against this, because our voices matter?
Oh, I totally agree. And I think that our primary job is to basically empower people, because I feel like I said before, as long as it's a small group of people controlling the conversation, you will never be included in that narrative. The people who are not sitting at the table will not be included. And I think that one thing that's important that you guys talked about with redlining, it is incredibly important that you are able to quantify whatever issue it is. Because when I walk in, I lead our Hill advocacy. When I walk into Congressman Cardenas's office, his staffer's first question is to me, how does this affect the people in my district? And if I can't actually at least come up with some sort of estimate of how that's actually a problem, it's very difficult to move forward with a solution. But for you guys that are out there working in the field in your cities, you can start this conversation before it's a problem. That just fills my heart that you guys are when Majestic brought up that their mayor is actually making this a priority to bring different departments in and talk about it before it's a specific problem, to get lots of hands on deck. Because if you wait until it's an issue, it's very difficult to address. Because what I think about in my neighborhood in DC, I live in a neighborhood that on one side of the stop sign is housing projects, and on my side of the stop sign, it's $800,000 row houses, okay? And so if you are in the 5th grade, you will have a very different outcome if you live on my side of the stop sign versus if you live on the other side of the stop sign. The reason why is because the kids on my side of the stop sign will know how to code when they get to high school. They will be savvy in all sorts of apps. They have an entirely different lexicon than those kids on the other side of the stop sign. And we literally live 0.01 miles apart. And so I think that we have to think about how do we quantify these problems and think about those solutions before it becomes an actual fire drill. And then also in terms of what people can do, one of the issues that has been consuming for us is working on net neutrality. We have to be able to think about what are the obstacles for people to be able to get online. And one of the things that Angelique brought up earlier was talking about entrepreneurs. One of the largest groups of online entrepreneurs is Black African-American women, one of the largest, fastest growing groups of entrepreneurs. Well, what obstacle does it pose when they don't have net neutrality in their neighborhood? It's making more and more expensive. And a lot of those people who want to start businesses are limited to mobile only. That's the only access that they have. And the truth is that's not equivalent to having maybe a desktop or landline access. So we have to think of some of these problems as they're evolving, because the truth is that if it's a problem now, how much of a problem is it going to be 7 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now? So if we can find a way to quantify that by district, that will be a lot easier. And in terms of how people can get involved, I encourage all of you, bring your local congressmen, mayors, bring it up in town halls, call their offices, make as much noise as possible. If you don't have time to call the FCC, I would be remiss if I did not actually bring up one of the celebrities in the room. So former FCC Commissioner Clyburn, who's sitting right over there, hey. And so at NHMC, we're constantly knocking on her door when she was at the FCC. And so I think it's so important, have a relationship with these people. Tell them what's important to you. Tell them why it matters. And even though it feels like the sky is falling, tell them why your problem is a priority, because it affects all of us.
Okay, so we're going to go to questions. Katie's going to come up, and Bill, use your microphone so we'll share.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kat.
All right.
Howdy. I'm Craig Settles. I'm a broadband industry analyst. I just finished a report last week on the relationship between telemedicine and broadband. And if you don't have good telemedicine, or better, that if you don't have good broadband, you'll never have good telehealth. Right? And so I wanted to follow up on the question about accountability and quantifying the problem. Do you think there is a problem with a lack of telehealth brought on by a lack of broadband? And how would you recommend starting to address this issue?
I'll just jump in here really quickly while everybody collects their thoughts, because this is something a lot of our coalitions work on. And I know that FCC Commissioner Carr is also going to be working on a lot of telehealth issues per the recent announcement. I think that it's important to kind of think about, especially in rural communities, how that's a challenge, because I feel like they tend to, the nonprofits who work on rural are usually the ones who make the most noise about how important it is to have access. And so that's usually for us going to be our go-to in terms of advocates. But I think that we have to think about, in terms of telehealth, if you don't really know, it's hard to quantify that problem, like, because it's before the actual issue has taken place. But we think about how can we get better? How can we actually, for example, they used psychiatry. How many people in rural communities basically wouldn't go drive like 80 to 100 miles to go to a local psychiatrist, and all of the different like stigma that's associated with it? But if we had telehealth, that would actually have a direct impact on the number of suicides in a certain zip code. And so I think that we have to find ways to actually specify an actual problem and then work from there, because especially with telehealth, you're always talking about ways that you can get better. It's hard to say that it would have prevented X.
In the cities, right, you now have, in most large urban communities, you have safety net hospitals and other safety net health providers who've taken on, well, in some states, very large new populations of Medicaid patients. And all those systems have reoriented themselves because of federal pressure and other reasons in the last 15 years to electronic health record systems, which go all the way down to patient access, that a huge amount of the research and practice reform that's going on in all health systems now is the use of electronic communication, record sharing, other kinds of things for purposes of improving care, right? It also has a lot to do with the economics of delivery, right? Particularly for safety net populations. So in Cleveland, one of the strongest connections that we have, institutional connections, is with the county hospital, which is the biggest safety net provider. And I know this is true in San Francisco, it's true in Portland. There's a few other communities where this is going on, where digital inclusion providers and the people who worry about the ability to onboard low-income, particularly new Medicaid patients into the health record systems come together in figuring out ways to do that with client populations, patient populations. So one of the, I don't want to step on Liz, but one of the interesting network projects that DigitalC is looking at is a partnership with that institution to do some network development for patients in their immediate neighborhood on the west side.
And part of the data that hospital system has recently partnered with the local councilman on is we have one ward in the city of Cleveland that has community-wide Wi-Fi. Doesn't work in the home, but it works throughout the ward, externally outside. So it's a start. Residents that are recipients of that Wi-Fi are 60% more likely, the data has shown, to use online medical records to communicate with their doctor and to keep up on their health care. So we're starting to quantify some of that data and to understand the impacts, and that's why we have that hospital system, which is an anchor institution, coming to us saying, like, we see the value here and we're looking to make an investment.
Well, let me just make one comment. I know we talk a lot about telemedicine in terms of getting care remotely, but from a medical device perspective, the future of medical devices is going to be connected nodes. So it's going to be monitors that you'll wear and that will be sending information over a network back to the hospital, back to the doctor, communicating with things. So you might have something on your watch that is communicating wirelessly to something implanted inside of you. So not being connected will not just be an access to, getting checkups or getting care. It's actually going to be life or death. And that is an inevitable trend that's just going to come. So I think, as was mentioned, these things that are seemingly okay, we have one issue here, are going to become life and death as we get 30, 40 years down the road.
Okay, do we have another question over here? Kat? We're going to try and keep the questions and answers a little short so we can make sure to get in a few.
Okay, well, you probably ought to find someone else.
Hi, I'm Polly Gifford. I work with installing fiber for the last 20 plus years in school districts, and have been working in rural communities in the last 3 or 4 years, and you see the difference. The question I asked, do y'all feel like there's a misinformation, and that makes it sound like it's purposeful, about the real need for broadband in rural communities? And some of the data saying that communities have broadband, but when you get into them, they don't have it. And I just looked at a website that said that 92% of districts in Pennsylvania have met their internet and connectivity. And that's in contrast to what we heard this morning, isn't it? So I'd like to get comments on that.
Well, it isn't just in the country. My census block in the city of Cleveland is listed in the FCC data as having, I believe, 75 meg service, right, from AT&T. I get 5. What's the difference? The difference is that in that census block, which has a lot of apartments, right, there are 4 homes which can get served by the box on the tree lawn, right, and everybody else gets served by an ADSL cross box on Archwood Avenue across the street from me, right? So anything anybody says about connectivity in the city is exaggerated by that kind of factor, right? So, and I think that's, it's true of all kinds of census block information, and I think it's something that actually nobody at the FCC would actually argue with at this point, I guess. It's a real problem with that data. But it does tend to get used to minimize the degree of the problem, for sure.
Other questions?
Hey, Bill, this is Stu Johnson with Connected Nation, Connect Ohio. Bill, could you go into a little bit more detail about the evaporation of the lower tier speed thresholds? I think that's just as pervasive as the access issue.
Okay, I'll do it real fast. I'm sorry, Deb. Well, again, I'm talking here about AT&T and Verizon. We haven't looked at other providers, so, you know, for all I know, Windstream has a completely different situation. I don't think they do. So AT&T, if you'd gone back 3 years, you would have found, I believe, 5 tiers of speed and prices, right? This is back in 2014, right? There are now 2, right? There's the up to 5 megs costs you $50 a month after the first year, and 10 to 100, right, costs you $60, right? And needless to say, the merger has gone up at the bottom and down at the top, right? So effectively, what that's, you can either pay for whatever they can give you, $65 a month, or because with the taxes, right? Or you can pay Spectrum $65 a month for 100 megs. So who's going to pay AT&T? Nobody. And if they're educated about it. So what does that say? It says AT&T is basically on its way out of the city. But in the meantime, they're going to take as much money as they can from poor people. Verizon has a similar situation. Verizon's a little complicated because with DSL service, you have to have a phone line, so you have to factor that in because how many people would have a landline otherwise, right? But it's the same kind of prices. And for Verizon, you can get, I believe it's $768 is $50 a month. And then anything above that, up to 100, is in the 60s. So it's the same pattern, and it's happened in the last 2 years.
So we are really at the end, but I do want to ask each of you to give me one quick bit of information. So we have a lot of cities, towns, and counties here in the room. If they're just beginning to address these issues, what would be your top recommendation on where they should start and how they should move this forward in their community? So we'll start with you.
I encourage everyone to talk to people who have a platform. So if that's your mayor, if that's your county, your utility administrators, your lieutenant governors and governors, and your elected officials that go to Washington, talk to people who have a platform that can amplify the issue. Because again, this is a very small group of people in this room. And if you had gone to talk to people in your neighborhood about their connectivity, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. And we need to do better because, again, there is a cost to keeping people disconnected.
In short, I think I would just recommend that people get creative. There is not a one-size-fits-all solution to this. We in Cleveland don't really have much support from our administration politically, so we're doing this, in a hodgepodge way through donations, through partnerships, through collaboration building. And if you ask for help, people will come forward and understand the value to the work that you're doing. And there's creative ways to get it done.
If you're dealing with your elected officials, don't downplay the role of convening and facilitation. So even if they don't always want to open up their pocketbooks and open up the ledgers, there's still a role to say that you're being forward thinking on this issue and kind of speak to the interest and the self-interest of being a forward thinker around these issues versus looking at it, they don't contribute economically, they're not interested.
I would say in Louisville, one thing we try to do really well is build collaborative networks to solve some of these issues. Hardware access is a big problem. We use a nonprofit that actually does fix the computers. We actually get the computers from corporations in the area. So the more that we can come together with the limited assets that each node has and really start tackling this as a team, I think the better.
That point more broadly, that if the most important thing about digital inclusion as a task in your community is that there must be somebody there who you don't know, or maybe you do, for whom that's a task they want to do. And they know something about it, and they have connections, and they have other friends and networks who you can work with. So that's where you start, right? You don't start by doing it yourself. You start by finding the people who do it and partnering with them. And I'm not saying they're everywhere, but it certainly is worth looking first.
Thank you. So before I ask you to thank our panel, I want to give you directions for lunch, because after all, that's an important thing. So we will have food out where the breakfast was, And I'll encourage you to get your food and come back in because we have a keynote speaker that you won't want to miss, and that's former Commissioner Mignon Clyburn, who is going to talk to us about her work at the FCC and the issues we are discussing today. So will you please join me in thanking our wonderful panel?